Hello, my name is Monique Ameo Constance, and this is my response and submission for Portfolio 2. In regards to my research insights, the first is going to be the concept of the pedagogical theorist. Dr. Latson Billings regards herself as a pedagogical theorist, or one who thinks, quote, deeply and seriously about the art and craft of teaching, end quote. I love this so much, and I'm so excited to have found a name for who I understand myself to be. I feel a deep connection to the academic theorists who've come before me. I also believe that teaching is an art and have a professional goal of training Black teachers to teach Black children, honoring Du Bois here in his observations of what it means of teacher education for Black teachers. The idea of viewing the curation of teacher education as an artistic theory of sorts aligns very much with how I view myself as an educator and teacher leader. My second insight is the component one of culturally relevant pedagogy. Dr. Latson Billing writes of the ubiquity of the term and pedagogy she created. I personally cannot imagine what it must feel like to see the morphing of what I've created for the benefit of Black children to become a buzzword in academia. To return to its original definition and intent, she writes of CRP's components. The first, quote, a focus on student learning, end quote. The intellectual growth of the student should be the foundation of any curricular and instructional practice. However, the definition of student learning is subjective to various stakeholders. I am interested to see which definition is most impactful on the holistic growth of the student. And just as a caveat, or I guess an aside, when we talk about student learning, Billings talks about what that means for the intellectual growth of the student. But for certain districts, especially, I have a lot of experience in the charter school. This growth only looks in regards to standardized testing, and so I'm interested to see which schools and even which teacher education programs who focus on the intellectual and personal growth of the student rather than standardized testing, who just based on data is most impactful. The third research insight is again underneath the culturally relevant pedagogy understanding component two, which is to quote, developing students' cultural competence, end quote. This is really important, and I wonder what this means when you have a teacher who is not culturally aware. As an English teacher leader, I am interested in the development of culturally competent professional developments that guide teachers in understanding the sociopolitics of the literature they teach. A culturally incompetent teacher cannot develop this competency within a student. Latson Billings writes of the importance of teachers understanding cultural nuance. I think this is really important when I think about it in regards to ELA, especially in secondary classrooms. If a teacher is, let's say, teaching Things Fall Apart, a novel by the Nigerian author Chinua Achebe. What does this mean if they do not know about colonization, or they're uncomfortable having conversations about colonization? How can they impactfully teach this literature if they know nothing about Nigeria and are not doing are not self-aware to find that information? I definitely align and think that to develop a student's cultural competence, we must have culturally competent teachers first. Component three of CRP is to quote, supporting their critical consciousness. According to Latson Billings, this is a component of CRP that answers the question of why students are learning what they learn. This component imparts perhaps my favorite aspect of teaching literature and writing, which is the sociopolitics of it all. Again, my background is in international relations, so I look at everything from a socio-political frame. If a secondary ELA teacher is reading Macbeth in an urban classroom, how do they connect Elizabethan literature to students? I know teaching Macbeth in New Orleans meant we created Macbeth's hit list, right? Because they were able to understand, oh, his old lady's trying to get him to kill everybody and he's got to protect the throne. Because they're so desensitized to violence, because my students in this city are often intrigued by violence because they've seen it so much, and all of these other components, it's easier to talk about Macbeth in a way that they get. And so that was always a nice approach to it. The ability to translate literary nuances is important. And I think about the training of ELA teachers. It is perhaps the most important aspect when trying to positively shift engagement and growth and literacy. We have to find a way to engage our students with literature, and that is their social consciousness. I definitely believe in secondary English classes the importance of contextualizing and just teaching the kids what the writers and the artists were responding to on a political level. My This would be my fifth, my fifth research insight would be the corrupted practice of culturally relevant pedagogy. I write this as an educator who has only taught in charter schools, and I can confidently write that all of us have been victims of corrupted practices of culturally relevant pedagogy, and thus our students are victims of the education that we enact upon them. Latson Billings write that this looks like, for example, reading something Black, and this is very, very true. I have had instructional coaches tell me that it was important for Black students to see windows and not mirrors. This was in response to me not wanting to teach The Great Gatsby as the canon for a unit on the American Dream. I wanted to switch it to The Invisible Man. And so I was told windows, not mirrors. But I always countered that old and dead white men was not the reality of our students' windows. When they look outside in the Ninth Ward or the West Bank or Algiers or the 17th Ward, they are not seeing The Great Gatsby. So I never understood that. I struggle with non-people of color being in control of creating the curriculum for students of color. I think that is where the corruption comes in, because if we just make a unit about a Black person, we have done our due diligence. And often there's such a huge gap in that. The sixth research insight was the multilingual rejection of assimilative education. The section wrote of the integration of Black South African language in an apartheid state and post-apartheid education. The South African apartheid state banned the instruction of Bantu languages in the 1950s. So Black South Africans for a very long time were not allowed to speak their native languages. They were only allowed to speak either Dutch or English. And so the reemergence of such languages becomes a rejection of such assimilative practices. I think of multilingualism as important. This undergirds my approach to creative writing in my classes, which gives students a chance to operate in the language that is perhaps most natural to them. I do always have some students who say, well, I don't speak that way. But creative writing definitely gives students the freedom to be able to write in a way that is most comfortable to them. I know that the acquisition of standard English is a matter of survival in the current system. I struggle often with enforcing these rules because I know the access that an acquisition of standard English can give you, but I also want to honor the way my students speak. Next was ratiolingualism. Quote, the framework of ratiolinguistic ideologies allows us to examine not only the eyes of whiteness, but also its mouth and ears. This was very, very interesting to me. My father was from a British colony. He was 7 when Ghana gained its independence. So the first few years of his education were colonial. He often imbued us to speak the Queen's English. That was always very important for him. We speak the Queen's English. I always found this interesting because he was also very anti-colonial and very pro-Black. However, he held on, he really grasped onto this colonialist approach to language. He saw it as a marker of intellect and survival. He always told us you have to learn how to play their game in order to survive. And he knew that communication and communicating like them was a way that we were possibly going to be able to get access to places, like colleges, universities, and ultimately jobs. So the white mouth and ears are access points to colleges and universities and jobs. When teaching multilingual students, I question, do we teach them to bend to this gaze or this mouth or this ear, or do we allow them to flourish in their cultural linguistic space while potentially limiting their access to such spaces? So I understand, there are a lot of teachers who are very, abolitionist in mind. But are we doing our students a disservice if the systems in which we are against have not changed in a way that would be accepting of what we are pushing into our students. You know, even the most abolitionist of teacher still subscribes to standard English in the academic space, and so it's almost a contradiction. I think that I think needs to just be discovered. It's a contradiction to call yourself an abolitionist teacher, but you know, you're writing dissertations with AP, you know, APA or MLA formatting. Like, I don't know. That's something I definitely think I want to look more into as I continue my studies. Next, we had, they wrote about the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. Quote, it said, not insignificantly, the tensions between African American and various immigrant groups are often fueled by dominant discourses that position the interests of African Americans and immigrants at being at odds. This section was important to me as I am the daughter of Black immigrants who teaches mostly Black American students. I think as a first generation student, I live in between these two worlds of not quite American, not quite African, and so I've lived my life in that middle space, and so I have been grown to become a believer of global Black power and align with the concept of negritude, which was a thought, a school of thought in the 1930s that honored Blackness and the individual experiences of Black people across the diaspora. And I'm a believer in that. I think it is important for me to use my work in the globalization of educating Black children and teachers. As my focus is on secondary ELA classes, I use global examples of Black art, literature, and socio-political history within my unit. So not just Black American literature, but I think it's important for my students to understand that Blackness is global and to introduce them to other ways that Blackness can exist outside of the American system and outside of the American boundaries. Um, my ninth research insight was decolonizing teacher education. Quote, we need something more than this. And this that the writer was referring to was kind of these very kind of buzzword loaded professional developments. And I think that decolonizing teacher education is important in the design of professional developments in teacher education. The buzzword loaded and white led seminars on cultural practices are merely remixes of assimilative education. I know that the school I teach at now, my school has paid thousands of dollars to an organization where I have to sit in 3-hour professional developments for white people who have just learned to even face their own whiteness, who are now telling me how to put CRP practices into my classroom and the levels of racism. And I think it's, I never really respect it. I have a hard time accepting white teachers as leaders of CSRP practices. The term decolonized, as explored by Fanon in 1961 in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, suggests that there must be violence for decolonization to occur. What does this violence look like in the world of education? Reformation is not decolonization, destruction is. We must destroy what exists and imagine a completely new educational system devoid of any hints of white and assimilative practices. I think the word decolonize is thrown around very loosely. I think the word decolonize is, um, it's been co-opted, I think, from its original meaning. If people actually studied the term decolonize, then they would not be, I don't know, it wouldn't be what it is, right? Decolonization, even in this Paris and Aline book, I think did not reach the full extent of what decolonize looks like. And so perhaps we need to find a different word because it is not this. I don't think you can't reform a system. Working from inside the system is not decolonization. All right, then we have narrative as data analysis, and this is from the Patel book. I appreciate Patel's narrative approach to the discussion of the relationship between immigrant students and education. A lot of the books we read in these master's level courses are dense and full of tables and charts and clinical observations of people. Patel's approach brings life to the experiences of people, which allows one to see the people and the experiences most important as a means to the end, which is the data analysis. And I think, yeah, you can tell a lot by just watching people. You know, you do not need these kind of qualitative and quantitative methods to, I don't know, that's also a colonialist approach, right? To look at people and cultures and to put them into boxes and charts and data. So I'm glad that she came with this narrative approach. The next research insight was undocumented students, which is also important to me because, again, this is my first year working with a heavy, heavy, heavy undocumented population. I worked at one school that was predominantly Black for 3 years, but recently an old student reached out to me and I edited 2 scholarship essays for an undocumented student who did not learn they were undocumented until last month when they began applying for college. And maybe not last month, but a few months ago. They recently emailed me to say that they received $20,000 a year to attend college, a dream they thought was halted by their status. Patel does a wonderful job in educating us of the very personal ways in which immigration policies have acted as barriers to education, particularly for young women. This particular student was a young woman who spoke of her mother's journey from Honduras to New Orleans, um, picking, working in the fields and just super uneducated. And so for her to find that she is undocumented at the very end, right? But being able to overcome that is a really beautiful thing. And I just wonder what other avenues there are for us to impart education on students who also have to worry about the legalities of their status. And then the last section is the long game of undocumented education. Quote, he was back to the snail's pace that he'd been at before the gilded green card arrived, end quote. I have students who remind me of Eduardo, who this he is in reference to, who are working and are living independently, waiting on a visa while trying to educate themselves. This is the incredible burden of undocumented students, the fear of their education being taken away from them. This is one aspect of education that American students do not have to face. And so I do not believe that the school system has any real proper implementations that protect our undocumented students outside of just the legalities of outing their status, but even that's tricky. And that goes back to having culturally competent teachers. If you are a teacher who does not believe in accepting illegal immigrants, how will you teach these students? How are you going to regard them? If their education is in your hand, which way are you going to push them towards? You can either help or hinder. And so that's something that's also very interesting to me as well. All right, my reflective insights. The first is that I am an andragogical and pedagogical. Is it andragogical? I'm sorry, an andragogical and pedagogical theorist. I have finally found a name for the manner in which I approach teaching. I am home. I feel like okay, I know what it is. So long, I feel like I've been searching, and so I'm glad to have done these readings to find a name for what for who I'm developing into be. I've included andragogical because teacher education is important when understanding how to best teach students. In my opinion, this must be conquered first. And when I mean this, I mean adult teacher education. The pedagogy is weak without it. If you have a weak teacher, your pedagogy, forget about it. You could write the best curriculum in the entire world, but if you have a teacher who has not been built, it's all gone. It's all for nothing. My second reflective insight is I hold colonialist views on language. I really do. As an English teacher of students who are multilingual in mainly Spanish, English, and African American vernacular English, I struggle with this a lot. Reading the section about ratio lingualism exposed this bias within myself. I was born of a father who believed in the importance of refined literacy, and I carry that with me. I pride myself in the level in which I can communicate, but this level is measured against colonial standards of communication. Conversely, I'm versed in Kolokwa, which is, my mother is from Liberia, so this is Liberian Pidgin English, which is completely against all rules of standard English, right? And I was also raised in the South. I was raised in Georgia, so I understand and speak Black dialect well, but I'm also well versed in this kind of refined standard academic language. Does decolonizing ELA classrooms mean a complete disregard of literacy? This seems to imply that literacy is not important to multilingual communities, and I do not think this to be true. I just really wonder where, as we're looking to change what the curriculum looks like, Do we stray away from teaching standard English because it's the white man's language, you know? But we live in this world where that is guided by that and is guided by the acquisition of it. So this is definitely something that I tussle with internally in terms of, you know, wanting grading very harshly for the use of language and then feeling bad about it because it's like, well, that's how they speak. That is their cultural linguistics. So I don't know. That's something that I'll probably be reflecting on a lot more as I continue on in my career. The third reflective insight reads Dr. Latson Billings wrote about the corruptive nature of modern implementations of CRP. She discusses how CRP was not necessarily developed for the mastery of standardized testing. I include here Common Core standards as well. As I'm a curriculum designer who believes in CRP, I wondered the necessity of aligning my work to CCS, which I do not care for. I don't really care for standards. I think critical thinking really is all you really need sometimes, and everything else. You can think critically, you can hit all of the standards. So, as someone who wants to implement these curriculums into school, how will ignoring CCS impact the reception of my curriculum that I know positively impacts literacy in Black students? I have been throughout the 4 years of teaching, been developing these units that have, you know, 70% mastery, 80, 90, 100% basic and above. So if we are going to use data, right, to mark the growth of our students, does the curriculum have to use that kind of standard? I don't know. That's also something that I will have to reflect a little bit more on. Four is, quote, most of the youth I know work diligently to not be perceived as less intelligent, as often is the case when someone speaks with an accent in standard academic English in this nation, end quote. I reflect on this only in agreement. Having been raised by parents with accents, I understand the perception of intellect when an accented person speaks English. Excuse me, five, quote, illegal immigration to the United States and other developed nations is another type of Black market that is necessitated by sanctioned markets, end quote. This makes me think of the ways my undocumented students will be subject to the reckoning of free markets and need for an uneducated labor force. How do teachers protect them when such policies are out of our hands? So what does education look like for our most vulnerable? What does education look like for our undocumented? That's definitely something that I have to think about, especially because oftentimes when we think of undocumented immigrants, it's usually Latino, but Black people actually are also undocumented. My parents were undocumented for a very long time. Black people are also immigrants. And so, what does the education of these students look like? And how do schools need to shift the way that we are protecting our students once they leave high school? It's a whole other ballgame once they leave our hands. The final reflective insight begins with, quote, the structure of schooling then has logically, although regrettably, reflected priorities of content over relationships. I agree with this assessment. It makes me wonder how to include building foundational relationships as a part of the content. I believe it begins with teacher education and also being frank with the notion that not everyone should teach. I think, and I wonder, when I say I wonder what this looks like as a part of the content, I mean, are there sections in your content? Are there sections in your guidebooks? Are there sections in your curriculum where you make space for just communal space making? For a section where you have a conversation, not so much, you know, analyzing the literature or getting the kids to align their answers to a standard, but do you have a section that says, how are you doing? And teacher, I want you to spend 10 minutes, 15 minutes asking your kids how they're doing. And what does that look like? I think it's still a part. It could still be a part of the content if you find creative ways to navigate that. My three reflexive insights, kind of starting off with two questions. The first is, how can I decolonize myself as an English teacher? This is a question with evolving answers and something that takes deep personal work to resolve. I am not sure decolonization works well with the canon of secondary ELA courses and just the manner in which English is being taught in the school systems. Again, I talked about decolonization being violent. So what does the violent breakdown of the canon mean? I don't necessarily mean it means to just take all white books. And, that was always a perception. Whenever I would kind of counter about the canon in the classes, it was, oh, Miss Constance hates white people. She hates white literature, which is not true. J.D. Salinger is one of my favorite authors. I love, and that's right, even having to explain myself, no, I love white books. I love white authors. But I think, what does it look like? People are so beholden to the status quo that even suggesting that The Great Gatsby is not that great of a book, even suggesting that F. Scott Fitzgerald stole most of his writing from his wife, right? Like, we could talk about it in so many ways. So how can I do this independently? I think that is kind of where I'm at in my career, is how can I decolonize myself independent of the school system? Because I'm not sure that there is hope for the American school system when it comes to decolonizing, as the language is being used in this sense. My second reflexive insight is how to decolonize teacher education. Again, there are writings about decolonization, but most of what is considered to be anti-colonial is viewed as too radical to survive the current American system. How do we radicalize teachers without grooming them to be the black sheeps of their schools, which usually happens to vocal and anti-system educators? Again, when people talk about decolonizing teacher education, I think there's this very kind of surface level of, okay, our teachers are well versed in all of these identities, and they know to ask for pronouns, and they know to say they're a safe space, but then they're still teaching Walt Whitman, like, they're asking for pronouns at the beginning of class, and then they tell their kids to open up and let's read, um, let's continue reading Shakespeare. Like, that is a compromise. That is not decolonization. And so, in the development of these professional developments and teacher education modules, what does that really look like? And how do you radicalize the mind of teachers where they can navigate in these systems if they choose to work in a school? Or what are the alternatives to being able to teach in a way that is truly decolonized and giving students, especially Black, Brown, and Indigenous students, access to an anti-colonial curriculum and anti-colonial instructional practices? My third reflexive insight is the importance of narrative. Again, I really enjoyed the manner in which Patel approached this. Again, I also work as a filmmaker, and so I want to become more proactive in capturing the stories of my students, as their experiences are varied and beautiful and give great insight into the educational system in this country. Students are the most important stakeholders in this space. And so, I don't know, just kind of giving them a platform to tell their stories. That is the way of education. The original universities in Timbuktu, and I'm only going to reference these universities, African universities, of a space of communal learning, communal space giving. It is a Black tradition across the diaspora to tell our stories, and that is how you learn. And so I think that's really, really important. And I want to continue to do that, and I want to develop ways to teach other teachers to do this as well. This would look like, at the very least, gathering student reflections and integrating journaling in ELA classes. Narrative in the classroom also allows for communal space making, and it makes the students way more relaxed. And once they're relaxed, their minds are more open, and then you can pour into them whatever content or methodology that the objective of your lesson. And then to end, my self-grading rationale, I gave myself a 20 out of 20. I grade myself well here because I have deeply analyzed the reading, and I've done some deep personal reflection in the manner in which I teach and seek to educate other teachers. And these are my initial thoughts. I appreciate you so much, and I'll see you next time.